The Orlando Magic are coming for the top of the Eastern Conference, so how do they match up with one of the East's elite? We dive in to an early preview of Magic Knicks today on Locked On Magic.
You are Locked On Magic, your daily Orlando Magic podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And you are indeed Locked On Magic. Today is August 20th. It will be August 21st, 2025. My name is Philip Rossman-Reich. I'm the senior writer over at OrlandoMagicDaily.com, credentialed member of the Orlando Magic media since the 2012 season. On today's episode of Locked On Magic, we do part 2 of our conversation with Gavin, Schall of Locked On Knicks. Today, we dive into the nitty-gritty. We talk about how the Magic and the Knicks actually match up, how these two teams would face each other if it came down to it in an Eastern Conference semifinals or Eastern Conference finals. We're going to get into a little bit of that coming up here in just a moment. First, we want to thank you again for making Locked On Magic part of your day every day, no matter when you listen to us, whether it's first thing in the morning, whether it's right when we upload. We truly appreciate you making Locked On Magic part of your day every day. You can make Locked On Magic even bigger part of your day by being one of our Orlando Magic dailies and listening every single day. Get in the habit now. We're still going 5 days strong, even during this offseason. Get into the habit now before the season starts, because once season starts, we're going to be going, it's going to be like a snowball picking up steam. We're going to be heading way downhill. You can check that out wherever you download podcasts, the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team every day. Today's episode of Locked On Magic is brought to you by Monarch Money. Take control of your finances with Monarch Money. Use code LOCKEDONNBA at monarchmoney.com for 50% off your first year. Having said all that, without much more further ado, let's get into it. Conversation with Gavin, Schall, talking about the Magic Knicks matchup specifically and what a potential Eastern Conference playoff series between these two teams would mean. Let's get to it now.
All right, I wanted to get into how the Knicks and Magic specifically match up. And it's this weird thing where it feels like they've played a million times the last 2 years. And yet, Philip, I don't know if I have a great gauge of how they match up, because in 2023, 24, it felt like the Knicks were always injured. In 24, 25, it felt like the Magic were always injured. What's your sense? What would your hypothetical optimism be if these two teams come into an Eastern Conference semifinals or an Eastern Conference finals, both relatively healthy? How do you like Orlando's chances in that series? And what do you kind of think would be the key matchups in that series?
Yeah, I think they're what I find fascinating about these two teams is they have both had games where they did exactly what they wanted to do against the other. There are games where the Magic just look like they're pushing and shoving and frustrating New York to no end, and they're making shots. Paolo has a pretty good Madison Square Garden record, I feel like at this point. They don't have Cole Anthony anymore, so you don't have to worry about Cole coming to the Garden and putting on a show for his hometown.
Thank God.
But there have been games where the Magic do everything that they want and New York just look like they can't figure out their defense. And then there are games where there were games, especially last year, where the Magic just couldn't solve the offense that the Knicks have. They couldn't score against the Knicks defense. And it was just there never felt like there was a level, to that effect. I mean, we talked last year before to kind of preview and hype up that NBA Cup game. And Orlando obviously came in without Paolo and they had the 32-point cushion and just no-showed that game. New York just ran him out of the building. They ended up playing again in the makeup games after after they both lost in the NBA Cup quarterfinals. They ended up playing again in Orlando, and that was right after Franz's injury. New York ran him out of the building, and then of course the other game was Orlando on a back-to-back without Paolo, without Franz. I don't even think Jalen Suggs played in that game. No. The Magic found a way to beat the Knicks in New York. I don't know. I don't have a feel for these teams. I think the one thing that always stands out to me about the way the Knicks play now, especially, Orlando tends to struggle with 5-out offenses because they don't, they want to switch everything to just try and limit 3-point shooting. And the Knicks just seem to be the Knicks, I think, especially with Cat, make it really hard for them to maintain a presence in the paint. They leave that paint really open. And that goes against a lot of what the Magic are trying to do defensively and limits their physicality. So it I think that's the biggest thing that I look at is the Magic are kind of a coin flip against teams that can go 5 out.
It's interesting, right? But you mentioned
Yeah.
their success against Boston, like switching everything. And as we're talking, I'm thinking through, like, would the Knicks be better against that? And I do think the one advantage the Knicks have is that Jalen Brunson is one of the most comfortable players attacking the switch, one of the most comfortable players in isolation in the NBA in a way, not that Jason Tatum is very good at that, but like in a way that's helped, and Jaylen Brown for that matter is very good at that. But I think Brunson, especially in a playoff context, might even have a little bit of an edge on those guys with his ability to just make a big man look bad and put him on skates and get to his preferred spot in the mid-range and score over and over again. So that would be the main problem I would see for Orlando. But to that point, like, I think that would be very effective across the board in other ways. I don't really think another defense was that aggressive in selling out against the Knicks just because of like the way, again, with having Josh Hart out there and his unwillingness to shoot threes, like the Knicks were already playing with one hand behind their back. I don't think the Celtics, even as they were struggling that series, or the Pacers, ever really felt pushed to a point where they had to try that. And I'd be curious because we've seen like Mikal Bridges, like certainly like can get to that spot in the mid-range and rise up, but he's almost going to do that against the best defender in the league or the worst defender in the league. So it almost doesn't matter if you switch a guard on him because he's not going to get all the way to the rim. We saw OG Anunoby have a month-long stretch where Jalen Brunson was out, where he played like the best basketball of his life and had a 10-game stretch, right, where he's at like 28, 8 and 5, probably like true shooting in the 70s somewhere. Like he was just absurd. And all of a sudden he had a bag and he had a handle, but we haven't seen that consistently from him, where he's like, he's certainly in transition. He's willing to pin a guy under the basket and go get a dunk, but he's not someone you typically look for to like aggressively hunt a mismatch from the perimeter. Karl Anthony Towns is extremely limited as a passer off the dribble. And there are times, and maybe Mike Brown will be better about this than Tom Thibodeau, and like draw up sets to get him in the post against a cross match, right? And he is somewhat comfortable in the post, but attacking off the dribble, like he can certainly put his head down and get to the rim, but he's so much better going at opposing bigs than he is doing that to wings, because with wings, he knows that double team is coming, and he, as talented of a passer and orchestrator as he is, just like staring everything down, full view from the top of the key, Isaiah Hartenstein style, he is not a good passer against double teams. And maybe that's something he spends the whole offseason working on. Maybe it's something he gets better at, but I do think Orlando, like being very aggressive, switching across the board, will work very well against the Knicks. On the other end of the floor, again, like I think Mikal Bridges is really the key name. Like OG Anunoby, and this is why the Knicks paid so much to go get him and then paid so much to keep him. He's about as well equipped to guard Giannis or Paolo, just like the true freakish, hulkish tanks in the NBA as anyone, and hold up physically without a whole lot of help. And that's not to say Paolo wouldn't get his points on OG, but I think OG, just like he did with Kate Cunningham, we were talking about that debate before the show. Shout out to Kuka Heel. I think he can stop Paolo from scoring super efficiently. I'd be really curious about how Mikal does against Franz. And to me, that's a much better matchup for Mikal than like a Tyrese Halliburton or Tyrese Maxey, like a quicker guard. And we did see as the playoffs came around, he also did a really good job on Cade and holding up physically. But if that's a matchup where Franz, especially just using a lot of ball screens, dusts him or is able to get Cat on him and dust Cat, like I'd be really interested to see like what pressure points Orlando could poke at in the Knicks defense. And just like in the past, like how good Orlando has been at hunting weak defenders, because we saw Indiana's ability to just consistently put both Jalen Brunson and Karl Anthony Towns in the action, no matter where they were on the floor. And if that meant like Aaron Nesmith running pick and roll, that means Aaron Nesmith's running pick and roll. Do you think Orlando now with Bane is like pretty well equipped to do that?
Yeah, and I think that's something the Magic are really, when they're rolling and feeling good offensively, that's something they're really good at. If they sense that you're switching, they teach their guards to screen. Like I've watched them run drills where Jalen Suggs is setting screens for Paolo and Franz. Like they'll run, I don't know if you could call them inverted pick and rolls with the way that Paolo and Franz like play, but they'll run where their guards are setting screens so that they can get the switch that they want. So in a hypothetical playoff series, they would target Jalen Brunson. They'd be like, oh, Jalen Brunson, then the question becomes like, where are you hiding Jalen Brunson against this Magic team now? Now, we don't know what the offense is going to look like, but theoretically, the Magic have 4 guys who can run pick and roll in their starting lineup as the ball handler, and they can screen with any number of those guys. And that's that's really why getting Desmond Bane is such a big deal. And why it really does feel like it'll change things. It's not just that he's shot 38% from three last year. He's a career 41% 3-point shooter. He's also averaged 5 assists per game the last two years. Like, he will run he can run some more pick and rolls and make plays off the dribble a little bit more. Let's take a quick break from our conversation so we can tell you a bit about our friends from Monarch Money. Most people can't name all their financial accounts or even what they're worth, whether it's 401ks, properties, or investments. And when you don't have the full picture, you can end up leaving money on the table. That's why there's Monarch Money. It's an all-in-one personal finance tool that brings your entire financial life together in one clean, easy-to-use interface on your laptop or your phone. Monarch does the heavy lifting for you. You can link all your accounts in minutes, see clear data visuals, get smart categorization of your spending, and finally feel in control of your money without ever touching a spreadsheet. I use an Excel spreadsheet, or I've used an Excel spreadsheet to track my finances. It gives me a picture. I'm not going to deny that I keep track of everything, but I don't have the full picture. I don't have the averages. I don't have maybe a sense of when things are going up or down, when I'm spending too much. Monarch Money organizes all of that for you so that you can be in control, because knowledge is power and knowledge is control when it comes to your finances. Don't let financial opportunities slip through the cracks. Use code LOCKEDONNBA at monarchmoney.com in your browser for half off your first year. That's 50% off your first year at monarchmoney.com with code LOCKEDONNBA. I'm very bullish on Jalen Suggs. We haven't had a chance to really talk about Jalen Suggs and what his absence would mean, just even defensively. Like, I don't know if I would call him a Jalen Brunson stopper, but he's annoyed him. Like, Jalen Suggs will annoy you. Like, in a 7-game series, like having to deal with Jalen Suggs, if that series goes deep, by game 5 or 6, you're probably pretty sore. You'd have to be. And obviously the great players are going to find a way, but like Suggs last year, it's hard to like look too deeply into his shooting numbers because he didn't play very much. And he only played 6 games and 97 minutes with Paolo Banchero and Franz Wagner on the floor at the same time. Like, the Magic's top 3 players just didn't play together at all last year. But through the first 5 games, so before Paolo's injury, he was shooting 44% on catch and shoot threes. In 2024, much more robust. He shot 42% on catch and shoot threes. I think he's going to be a much bigger catch and shoot threat. And so even if you're, trying to hide a Jalen Brunson on him as the 4th wing option, which he's probably the 4th wing option now, the Magic will put him in a pick and roll with Paolo or Franz, try and switch Brunson onto him. And if there's confusion there, they'll kick back out to Suggs. And I think Suggs is a very confident catch and shoot 3-point shooter. Again, we'll see what he looks like coming off the injury. The injury is probably a little bit bigger than the Magic were letting on, but the Magic now, it feels like, have some offensive weapons, and that's how good that offense is. Feels like it's the ultimate turning point in question for how good this Magic team can be. On paper, it looks really good, or really interesting, at least.
It's so interesting because we always, like, I think when we frame title conversations, you'll hear, like, Zach Lowe obviously popularized this, but you need to be a top 10 offense, top 10 defense. Famously, Denver a couple of years ago was the exception to that, and they were so good offensively they got by with, at least in terms of regular season numbers, being an average defense. And there's just this immense pressure on the Knicks to have one of the greatest offenses of all time, because I think, again, if you are committed to playing Jalen Brunson, Karl-Anthony Towns in a playoff series, 36 minutes apiece, it's hard to be an above average defense. And I can pull up the numbers while I'm talking here, but they succeeded to some extent in being an above average defense, especially when they leaned into switching so much, and they were kind of betting, which I think is what they ultimately have to bet on, shooting variance coming out in their favor, right? And gambling a little bit and switching and having Mikal Bridges and OG Anunoby play as like backline free safeties and insulate the fact that Karl-Anthony Towns is just a really, really poor rim protector at times. And you know what? They could take that gamble. And if they force enough turnovers, and if OG and Mikal, and to a lesser extent, Josh Hart and Mitchell Robinson in his minutes on the floor, if they're just completely overwhelming defensively, they can get to like just good enough that if the offense is exceptional, they could put it all together and win an NBA championship. But they're operating on such fine margins, which I think, to Orlando's credit, again, this is very presumptuous because they have not even been an average offense in about 13 years. But if they're healthier, and if Bane, just as we talked about in part one of this podcast, makes everything work, like Orlando, like there's a very real world where they're a top 5 defense and a top 10 offense. And I think there's a little bit less like hoping and praying than what the Knicks have to do. But it's also plausible that Mike Brown, again, like through lineup optimization, through the depth they've acquired, gets the offense to a point where it's so overwhelmingly good that the Knicks can just play average defense, and they can profile as a legitimate NBA championship contender. I just pulled it up, by the way. They were 9th in defensive rating throughout the playoffs, given they made the conference finals. It's not terrible. They were just behind
like
the
a lot of
Indiana
that's,
Pacers.
but like the important point to make though is like in the playoffs, everything is matchup dependent. Like there are just some teams you don't match up well with, and some teams you do. Like all of us Magic fans were sitting here like no one can solve Indiana's offense. Orlando over the last 2 years, I think, is 3-1 or not 3-1 because that would be one season. They were 3-1 last year, 3-1 this year. They're like 6-2 against the Pacers over the last 2 years. Like the Magic are like the one team that had over the last 2 years has figured out how to slow Indiana. And all of us were sitting there like, get us healthy, give us a series with Indiana. We'll show you how to do this. And for whatever reason, like Orlando just knows how to play that team. Whereas like Boston the Magic have had some very good matchups with Boston. They've had some matchups where they just give up a ton of threes and they don't have the offensive firepower to keep up. And so I think what makes the Knicks different from Orlando, at least at this point, is you got to be able to win in multiple ways. Like New York, their defense during the regular season, I don't think it was like earth shattering, but it was good. It was good. It wasn't like some pushover defense. Their offense was obviously very, very good, but they could beat you in a shootout. They could slow the pace down and grind you to death too. Like their ability to play however the game needs them to play. The Magic only have one way to play. Like we were joking with the Celtics reporters after the Magic won in game 3, all the Boston writers were like, man, that game was ugly. And me and the other Magic writers were like, that was nothing. Like that's a Tuesday for us. Like we see that game every single time. Orlando had only one way and one hope to beat the Celtics. And when that's the case, you're not winning that series because there's seven different games. You got to win them all different ways.
I do think to that point that to me, that's like everything you're talking about is basketball maturity in some ways. And the Knicks have an advantage there because Paolo is still very young. Franz is still very young. Jalen Suggs plays like a veteran, but in terms of actual playoff reps, because
plays like a maniac. You could say it.
Yeah. Sorry, what?
He plays like a maniac. He doesn't understand.
I was going to say before when you were talking about it, he is below the Trae Young tier, but he is very high up on Knicks fans' hate lists, and that is a compliment to Jalen Suggs, because that is what Jalen Suggs quite literally gets paid to do, is for opposing fans to walk away and be like, screw that guy, man. I do not like him. I don't like how he plays, and that's to his credit, and it makes Orlando a better team. I do think the Knicks are battle hardened in a way. Orlando isn't. And to me, that would, again, not knowing anything about how next season goes and not knowing how Desmond Bane fits and a million other factors, how Mike Brown fits, I would tend to favor the Knicks in a series between the two teams. But I do think, to your point, I have some outsized confidence on my end because I've watched the Knicks destroy depleted Orlando teams. I'm sure you and Magic fans would probably have some outsized confidence on your end because they've watched the Magic at times destroy depleted Knicks teams. So we don't have the data we need. Like it's not, I want to say, like, I just did this with Tony East and we're like, oh, we have a million games to fall back on. It's a little irrelevant now that Halliburton and Turner are gone. But hypothetically, if Indiana was themselves or Boston was themselves, like, we know how those teams look against each other. We just don't know a lot about how the Knicks and Magic look against each other, which is what allows us to have this conversation for almost an hour. But I'm so interested to see how it goes.
Yeah, it's going to be real fascinating to see how these two teams change. Like we've hinted at how much the Magic's offense might change, and maybe the Magic could very easily be in the same boat that New York was in, where Jamal Mosley's taken them as far as he's going to take them. Like I'm a big believer that coaches have roles the same way that players have roles. Some coaches are the coaches that get you over the top and win you championships. Some coaches are the coaches that build you from the bottom, give you belief, give you the foundation to keep growing. Some coaches are the coach that takes you to the intermediate level, but just don't have the right makeup to get to the finish line. And, like Tom, I think even Knicks fans, correct me if I'm wrong, entered last season after they lost in the playoffs saying, Tom, this year we find out if Tom Thibodeau is that guy. It's the same issues that he was having in Chicago, same issues having in Minnesota. We're happy to have the success, obviously, and we're not going to throw that away after one trip. But, now we're serious about winning a championship. The Magic are the same way. Jamal Mosley has done a masterful job, in my opinion, growing this team from a 25-win team to 35 to 47 to 41 last year. And I thought he did a masterful job keeping the team together last year. There is a lot of belief in what they're doing, but now it's about winning. And when I think he's done a good job in his 2 playoff series against Cleveland and Boston. But now it's about, okay, you got to win a playoff series and you got to advance deeper into the playoffs and not, look like you're being outcoached or outclassed by anyone else. And if you don't feel like he can get you over the top, like I said in part 1, it's better to act early, be proactive about it and make that step, because, if you're reacting to stuff, that's when you lose control and the whole thing falls apart.
Yeah, definitely. Our biggest takeaway from the Tom Thibodeau experience was process over results. And I had my doubts that the Knicks front office, again, like, who am I? Like, they know a million% more about basketball than I do, but I had my doubts that they were going to recognize at least what I perceived as the issue, and that despite making the Eastern Conference Finals, the process wasn't very good. And they're, again, with a little bit of shooting variance going the wrong way, there was a world where they lost to the Detroit Pistons in like 5 or 6 games, and then Tom Thibodeau would have been immediately fired, and no one would really be questioning it. And so I'm happy they moved on from him as good as he was. I'm really curious to see how it goes with Mike Brown, because like a lot of the same issues might crop up, and Tom Thibodeau will be sitting on $30 million that he probably spends like just to have like 1 million basketballs in a mansion somewhere. I don't know what Tom Thibodeau does with his money. Laughing about
he plays it 48 minutes.
Yeah, 100%. All right. On that happy note, Philip Rossman-Reich, we mentioned it at the beginning, but one final time, could you tell everyone where they can find all of your fantastic work over here on the Knicks side if they want to learn even more about the Orlando Magic?
Yeah, the best place to find my work is obviously listen to Locked On Magic. We have fun, I like to think, have a good time. But the best place to find my written work is over at orlandomagicdaily.com, where I am pretty much the only writer, but I'm officially the senior contributor there.
All right. And same thing over here, Locked On Knicks, wherever you can find Locked On Magic, you can also find Locked On Knicks, YouTube, every single podcast platform. Be sure to check us out throughout the season. We say that on every show we do, but I do think when both teams are legitimate contenders with Philip, we've come up in the world from when we were probably doing these same previews 6 years ago. I think it's now maybe more pertinent than that's not the right word. More relevant than ever that you kind of keep up on your rivals.
Yeah, absolutely. And this one, like, we're gonna be on national TV early in the season. We're gonna find out where these 2 teams are very, very early on. That's a game I have circled on my list. So I'm very excited to see these 2 teams play.
Yeah, might as well. For Philip, I'm Gavin. We'll talk to you very, very soon on Locked On Knicks and Locked On Magic.
I want to thank Gavin Schall once again for having me on Locked On Knicks and sparking this discussion to talk a little bit about this matchup in particular. I think we can all admit and we can all agree that if the standings go the way we all think they're going to go, the Magic and the Knicks are indeed on a collision course for what would surprisingly be their first playoff matchup. Like, I remember some classic Magic Knicks games back in the 90s, didn't play each other in the playoffs, and then during those 90s run, the Magic and Knicks have never played each other in playoffs. And the fact of the matter is, as we hinted to and alluded to over the last 2 days, this has been a matchup that's been very interesting. The Magic have scored some really big wins over the Knicks over the last 2 seasons, just as the Knicks have had some really impressive wins over the Magic. There have been times where the Magic's defense has absolutely bugged them, and then there's been times where, the Magic can't score enough to keep up with them. Something I've hinted at, I do think one of the Magic's big struggles is against teams with stretch fives, because that pulls the Magic away from the paint. They're very much a positioning defensive team. And while they solved a lot of that problem against the Celtics, obviously, like, their offense gave up fast breaks and they got stuck in cross matches. They got, when their defense is set, they're usually pretty good. I think Magic Knicks would be a fantastic matchup. I'm excited that they do have a national TV game on the schedule this year, that they are going to get that opportunity. It'll be in Madison Square Garden, of course. It's going to be really, really fun. And, I think you could tell between Gavin and I, we've been on each other's podcasts a few times now. There is mutual admiration for how these two teams are built and what these two teams have accomplished. At the end of the day, we're going to start talking and thinking about these teams. And you could go to Locked On Cavs. I jumped on with Danny Cunningham of Locked On Cavs earlier this week, broke down where the Magic are at, how much of a threat the Magic might be to the Cavs, who are kind of the runaway favorite to be the top seed in the Eastern Conference. We'll see how that actually plays out here in a couple months. But these are really difficult teams, and these are really interesting teams that the Magic will be facing and that the Magic have had success against, but also have a lot to prove. Next week, we're going to hit this episode. I do want to talk about this, the path to 50 wins. And that path to 50 wins is very much about picking up wins the Magic have been getting and were getting last year, but they obviously need a little bit more. So, I'm big on this stat. And I think it's a stat that really showed that during the last 2 years, while the Magic were a good team, and I don't want to take away from them being a good team, it was a stat that showed they were really lacking in a key area and why they weren't considered contenders. The Magic had the fewest wins in the league among postseason teams against teams with winning records last year. Among Eastern Conference postseason teams, among the 10 Eastern Conference postseason teams in 2024, the Magic actually had the second fewest wins against teams above 500. Now, this may or may not matter. The Knicks famously couldn't beat the Celtics or the Cavs last year. I think they were like 1-8, 1-7 against those teams last year. And they ended up going to the conference finals where they lost to the Pacers. And you could kind of sense that maybe there was a little bit, I don't want to say panic, but there was concern that there's a reason why the Knicks couldn't get over that hump. And that's something they wanted to solve by letting Tom Thibodeau go, by getting Mike Brown. But I think this is like, if there's a stat that I'm going to be watching very closely, and the schedule isn't set up for us to know this particularly early, but if there's a stat that I'm going to be watching very closely throughout the year, it's how well the Magic perform in these games. Like we talked a lot about the national TV stuff where the Magic went 1-6 in national TV games last year. You got to beat the good teams. If you want to compete for a championship, if you want to win a championship, you've got to beat the good teams. And that's kind of where the Magic are lacking. And that's why matchups with the Knicks are going to be so fascinating and so important for this team because, Cleveland and New York are, Gavin said this, Cleveland and New York are far and away considered the best two teams in the Eastern Conference right now. The Magic have to break into that group. And the only way you break into that group, the only way you're taken seriously is if you win these games. We're going to get an early matchup with the Knicks this season to kind of get a temperature check of how good this Magic team is and where they're at compared to one of their chief competitors. And like we said, and like we kind of alluded to, this is a fascinating matchup from the matchup perspective, the way the Magic play defense, the way the Knicks play defense, the offensive weapons the Knicks have, the potential the Magic have to bother the Knicks in some ways and match up with them. I mentioned this before. Paolo plays really well in the Garden. It's a building that he likes. Smoothie King Center is oddly the other one. This is a fascinating fascinating matchup. And like I mentioned, maybe the beginnings of a healthy rivalry, a healthy little series of games that we'll see. So, we're going to be watching the Knicks very, very carefully throughout the season, and those matchups with the Magic will be very, very big. But that's going to do it for me today. I want to thank you all again for listening to today's episode of Locked On Magic. You, of course, find me on Twitter at @PhilipRR_OMD and on Blue Sky at PhilipRR. You can subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, TuneIn, Himalaya, Google Play, Spotify, Odyssey, and all the fun ways to download podcasts to your podcast-enabled listening device. So you can find me as well on YouTube. Just search for Locked On Magic. For the latest on the Orlando Magic, be sure to check out OrlandoMagicDaily.com. You can find us on Twitter at OMagicDaily. And for even more Orlando Magic content, be sure to check out my Patreon page at patreon.com/OrlandoMagicHub. I will be starting to go in more depth into these kinds of matchups against the teams the Magic are going to be competing against in the Eastern Conference. We'll do deeper dives on these matchups coming up on the Patreon page. So definitely check that out at patreon.com/OrlandoMagicHub. As always, thank you for your support. Now that you're done listening to Locked On Magic and making it your first listen of the day, go check out the Locked On NBA podcast because there is no offseason. Doug, Matt, and Hayes keep you up to date on contract negotiations, rumors, and everything you need to be the most informed NBA fan. Find Locked On NBA on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. It's all part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. That's going to do it for me today, though. I want to thank you all again for listening to today's episode of Locked On Magic. On tomorrow's episode of Locked On Magic, we'll recap Germany's game against Spain as they begin their last 2 preparation games before Eurobasket begins next week. We'll also talk about Shaquille O'Neal presenting Dwight Howard for the Basketball Hall of Fame induction ceremony, enshrinement ceremony coming up next month. We'll get to all that and more on tomorrow's episode of Locked On Magic to close out the week. But until then, for Orlando Magic Daily and Locked On Magic, this has been Philip Rossman-Reich. We'll see you again next time for another episode of Locked On Magic.